call it up.
To this video after you talk. Say it. Can you say it? Oh, yeah. Okay.
Good morning. Welcome to CHSA. I'm Walter Lim. I'm on the board here along with Will and David Lay. We are board members for Chinese Historical Society of America. I just want to personally thank you for taking the time to come here. I think you will have a very intriguing presentation from Professor Lew-Williams along with Professor Rogao. And we look forward to seeing you at more of these events. If this is your first time at CHSA, please catch David or myself and introduce yourself. We are about making the Chinese-American experience, connecting the history of that to today and to tomorrow. So simply put, that's what we're about. We hope to be able to do more of these kinds of things. I do want to make one introduction. The daughter of one of our founders is in the audience. Laureen, if you just raise your hand. Laureen Wu McLean, the daughter of Dr. Thomas Wu, one of the founders of CHSA. So we have a wonderful connection of the past to today and tomorrow. So again, welcome. Thank you for being here. Let us know if you have any suggestions. I'll turn it over to Professor Gao.
Thank you, Walter. It's such a pleasure to be here. As Walter mentioned, I'm a board member at DHSA, and I have the real pleasure of introducing to you all Professor Beth Lew-Williams. I've known Beth for a number of years now. I think we first met doing work together on the Railroads Project down at Stanford University, and I followed her career quite closely. She's certainly one of the most important thinkers and historians working in Chinese-American history today. So Professor Beth Lew-Williams is Professor of History and Director of the Program in Asian American Studies at Princeton University. She's the prize-winning author of The Chinese Must Go, Violence, Exclusion, and the Making of the Alien in America. Lew-Williams has held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. At Princeton, her teaching was recognized by the Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Award. Now, before I turn it over to Professor Williams, I just would like to give you an overview of what our program is going to look like for today. Professor Williams is going to come and give us about a 20-minute talk. We are then going to proceed into a bit of a discussion between her and me around the contents of her book. We will then open it up for discussion for all of you. So think about the questions you'd like to ask, because there's going to be plenty of time at the end for you all to talk to her as well. So without ado, let's welcome Professor Beth Lew-Williams.
Are we going to make this a little darker?
Yes.
On slides, that'd be great. Okay, that's great. Hi, welcome. I'm so glad that you're all here. It is a special thing to be able to speak in San Francisco and think about this history. I am a California native, although I live in New Jersey now. My parents are here in the room. And so I'm so grateful to be here with all of you. So what I thought I would do today is just talk informally a little bit about the book, just kind of give you a little bit of an introduction to it, and then read a little bit from the book, because I think sometimes that gives you a sense of what it is that I'm doing in a different way. And then we'll have a conversation. But I thought I would start with just the cover and the title, really. Because I chose to put this phrase, Doe Chinaman, on the cover of the book and as the title of the book. And it contains that, now ugly word, right? Chinaman in it. One of the reasons that I chose to do this is that it was this term, Chinaman, or Doe Chinaman, or John Chinaman, was so ubiquitous in the sources that I was looking at. So in this book, what I try to do is to reconstruct the history of a people. As many of you know a lot about Chinese American history, I bet. but a history that is still yet, a lot of it yet to be recovered. And for me, Doe Chinaman is something that really evokes that anonymity of the Chinese that still existed in the archive today. One of the statistics that I often, or facts that I often use to describe how common this sort of anonymization, the way the Chinese were forcibly rendered anonymous, is the 1852 census. So the 1852 census in California, they took names like usual, and here in San Francisco they recorded about 2,500 Chinese people. But of those 2,500 Chinese people, they only recorded about 24 names. All the rest, right, were just Chinamen. And this is from that census, although it's from Tuolumne County. And you can see what that looks like on the page, right? So in the place of a name, it says at the top, Doe Chinaman, and then profession or trade, China is the answer. That's what their profession or trade is. Place of birth, China. Last residence, China. And then after our one Doe Chinaman, that's just all Chinamen. But with different ages, so we have a sense, these are individuals, but we can't see it, right, when it's written down in this way. I think that one of the ways that we really get a sense of this is also through the visual archive, right? So not just the written, but also the visual. And so this is an image that has always struck me very strongly. I found it over across the bay at UC Berkeley in the Bancroft Library. It was in the scrapbook of a police officer, a man, Jesse Brown Cook, who had served as the head of the Chinatown Squad here in San Francisco, and then eventually rose all the way up to the chief of police in the early 20th century. And in retirement, he made these scrapbooks. I think it's something like 50 scrapbooks. And it's a weird assortment of things, and these, many of them images of criminals. But he also had this, which is a photo collage of Chinese children, right? He labeled it 2,700 Chinese boy babies of San Francisco Chinatown in 1889. And there's something about this image, right? It's just ominous. The way that they've been arranged, the way in which they have been made into an anonymous mass. When I first saw it, I was like, what is the provenance of such an image? Who would make such an image? How do we understand something like this? And after doing some more research, I think what most likely happened is that these images, it's a photo collage, right? So it's lots of different photos individually taken. I think what happened was that Chinese went into studios. They went into studios here in San Francisco. They liked studio photography. They brought in their newborn sons and maybe some daughters to be photographed so they could send baby announcements back home, right? Announce the birth of a child. And so that studio photographer, however, didn't just charge the Chinese who were coming in to get their images of their children, right? They also took those images, reprinted them, cut them out, which was an inauspicious practice, and then sort of made them into a mass like this, and then would sell it again as a curiosity to white Americans. And it just, for me, this is it's a story that captures that way in which individuals are dehumanized, right? Are made to no longer be individual. So in my work, what I'm trying to do in this book is to not just sort of look at the Chinese in that way that this police officer, Jesse Brown Cook, would have looked at them, right? When he pasted that image alongside the images of criminals. I'm trying to also, imagine what it's like to be these children looking out, right? Looking out from the image, looking out at the world, and trying to do what I can to construct what that experience would have been like. So in this book, I have a few central questions. So in my first book, some of you may know my first book, The Chinese Must Go, there what I was looking at was the formation of US border control and and the role of anti-Chinese violence in that formation. So it was really, I was looking at an exceptional moment of violence, and I was looking at an exceptional space, right, the border, that moment of crossing. In this book, what I'm trying to do is to move towards the more mundane, really, the everyday. What are the constraints on Chinese people's lives in every day in the 19th century? And so in this book, what I'm trying to do is to ask, what were Chinese people permitted to do as they just went about existing in the American West? What behaviors were permissible to them? What constraints did they have? And then to what extent, if there were things they were unable to do, to what extent is this determined by law, by governance, by policing, by the state? Right? And then third, how is it that Chinese negotiated, endured, or resisted this experience? So to answer this question, what I did was drive around a lot, drive around California and Oregon and Washington and visit local archives. So here are some of the doors. I started taking photos of doors that I walked through just to give a sense of where I was. And some of them are palatial, like the Huntington Library, very nice place to visit. Some of them, you know, a little less descript here, that's Tuolumne. The reason I had to drive around California is that I was interested in these county-level legal records that look something like this. They're court cases. Because the Chinese went to court a lot, sometimes against their will, but sometimes because they were fighting for their rights. And when they went to court, they would often testify. Despite laws against their testifying, they would testify to their lives and to whatever incident brought them to court. And I think that this testimony is actually an amazing and relatively untapped source of Chinese voices in the archive, right? Because you know, they would be translated at that moment in court, and we get to read the results. And so this is an example of a particularly large court case file. They're not all that large. And here's another one, People v. John Doe Chinaman. So you can see where we see that language in the court records themselves. And then I also, sort of going around to the counties, it's not just sort of those written records of courts, it's also the whole archive produced by a history of policing and incarceration. And so I just took a few images here to show you the sort of stories that are possible if we do look at these, you know, an archive of produced by policing and criminality doesn't seem like something where you can get individual stories out of it, but it's possible. So for example, here on the right, your left is Alum, who was, this is upon entry into San Quentin. And I think one of the striking things to me about this series is like a sequential series of mugshot photos as he entered into San Quentin, is that you can see in process the severing of his queue. Right? He was forced to cut his hair upon entry, which would have, you know, dishonored him at the time. The second image here, Ajo and I think it's Ali, I'm forgetting the name right at this moment. They were arrested in Sacramento. They were arrested for sodomy in Sacramento, and this very unusual mugshot photo was the product of that. They, instead of doing an individual mugshot, they did a combined mugshot with two people sitting side by side. And I think that this is like a glimpse, right, into the sort of intimacies that Chinese people had, but also the kinds of policing that they faced. This image is, it actually is right over in the library, in the San Francisco Public Library in the History Center. They have mug books that are, this is from the mug book, it's called the Tong Wars mug book, where they're attempting to sort of get a sense of Tong or like gang activity is the concept from the police. And to do that, they don't just take formal photos, they also raid people's apartments in order to try to understand this underground Chinese. And so the product is a mug book that's of many personal photos that have been repurposed and made into mug book photos. And I think that the personal photos are really very striking, right? And the last I have here is from Downeyville, California, in Sierra County. In Downeyville, it's interesting, this mug book has a woman at the top here. Very few mug books do have very many women. One of the reasons I think this is interesting is that this mug book, although held by a sheriff in Downeyville, California, it was actually made out of immigration photos. So for those of you who know the Gary Act, it required Chinese, after Chinese exclusion, to all be photographed to get their certificates of residence. In Downeyville, they took a duplicate of those photographs and gave them to the sheriff, and then that allowed the sheriff to then also be able to monitor the Chinese community. In my work, in addition to going around to archives, looking at these county-level legal records and these photographs, the other thing that I did is I teamed up with a student at Princeton who then is now an assistant professor of public policy at Duke University, Hannah Postel, who has many more technical skills than me, to try to create a database of anti-Chinese laws. So I think a lot of focus when we talk about anti-Chinese laws, we immediately think of Chinese exclusion, the laws that kept or attempted to keep Chinese out of the country. But in fact, there were lots and lots of local laws as well. Historians and law professors have carefully tried to document these laws. You may have heard of a Q ordinance or a Cubic Air Act or the foreign miners tax. Some of these laws, what Hannah and I decided to do was to try to find all of such laws. And so we digitized and made into ugly Excel sheets like this, all laws from 182 municipalities across California, Oregon, and Washington, and then searched them using keywords, but also machine learning to be able to find these laws across places, to be able to see where laws moved and were copied. And we found more than 5,000 laws. Okay. With that, how are we on time? I was going to read a little bit.
I think you should go ahead and read it.
Okay.
And then we're doing 45.
Okay, so to be able to read, I think I'm going to sit. Because, oh yeah, light's perfect too, or else I'm going to drop a book or drop this mic. Yeah?
Well, I'm going to pull up the mic.
Okay, great. I guess the problem with sitting is I really can't see your books in the back. But I'll try to be loud. Okay, so I wanted to read a little bit just to give you a sense of the book. And so I thought I would start with a story that I end the introduction with. It's a story of one man. It's based on his oral history that he gave in 1924. He gave it to a researcher at Stanford, and so you'll see, I want to warn you ahead of time, the interview was in English, but you'll see his sort of slightly faltering English as I'm reading it aloud, and any biases that the transcriber may have had, right? And since I'm going to read a lot of his quotes, I'm going to try to signal to you when I'm going back and forth out of my voice and his voice, just to give you a sense. Okay. But I'm going to do this because I feel like we can only talk, we can only understand so much talking in generalities, and it's better to go into individual stories. Okay, so this is the story of Panny Lowe. Born in Portland, Oregon in 1873, Lowe journeyed to China for his education and then returned to America, moving between major Western cities, first San Francisco, then Denver, on to Portland and Seattle. By the time Lowe sat down with a researcher for an interview in 1924, he had acquired a lifetime of knowledge about the racial regime of the American West. He had learned, for example, that he could go to some restaurants and not others. This is a quote. Quote, "I once go into a restaurant. They refuse to serve me. I don't want to cause trouble, so I just walk out. Whole lots of things like this happen, but I forget. Now, when I want to eat, I go to Chop House. No trouble there. He knew some restaurants did not want him, knew chop suey joints were safe, and made the choice to avoid possible humiliation. He also learned he could go to some barbers and not others. Quote, "Lots of time people insult me. Once I remember I go barber shop. I sit 1 hour, no ask me what I want. Pretty soon barber say, what you want? I tell him I want haircut. How much? He says, $3. That makes me mad. But I make him cut my hair just the same. I never go to that white bastard again."
Yeah.
You know, he knew that price gouging was a form of discrimination, but also that money could sometimes buy access. And over time, he learned that legal action could also open seemingly closed doors. Quote, "My second wife take my little girl, born in this country, to have her hair cut at Frederick and Nielsen. They say they very sorry, they no cut Chinese hair. Oh, my wife get mad, she go see lawyer, she tell him all about it, Mr. Sullivan. He write letter to Frederick and Nielsen. They write back and apologize." Lowe knew the pain of being refused service. He knew illegal discrimination when he saw it, but he also learned that avoidance was easier than confrontation. Quote, "All the time I tell my wife, keep away from those swell places, only make trouble." He knew how to mind racial rules and move on. He learned he could live in some neighborhoods and not others. Quote, "In Portland, I want to live in residential district, but they make lots of trouble if you try to live outside of Chinatown." He learned about this trouble from his friends. One friend, he born in this country. He buy $6,000 house in the Rose City district. White people make hell lot trouble for him. They take it to court. He fight it. Just the same, they kick him out. He can own house, but no live there. Lowe knew the Chinese were supposed to be equally protected by American law, but he knew that in practice, the law protected white neighborhoods from Chinese encroachment. Quote, "I think that very unjust. Those people very uncivilized, have no regard for humanity. So when my friend have so much trouble, I decided to stay in Chinatown. Nobody care there." He knew some spaces reserved for white people and chose not to test the line. Given all this, I skipped a bit there. Lowe learned that American law held uncommon sway over his marriage prospects. He could marry some women and not others. Quote, "Not allowed marry white girl, not enough American-born Chinese to go around. China only place to get wife, not allowed to bring them back. For Chinese, very unjust, not human, very uncivilized." He knew that anti-miscegenation and exclusion laws would forever mark his family. He knew that enduring such indignities was a condition of living in the American West. Given all this, Penny Lowe knew that he would never belong. Quote, "When I was a young fellow, I felt I'm American. I'm no Chinaman. Now I get more sense. I know I never be American, always Chinaman. I no care now anymore." He lived at the margins of American society and didn't know if he should hope for more. Quote, "Very hard to tell whether people treat better now than before. Sometime I think so, sometime I don't think so." He didn't know if there had been progress. Still, he held out hope that white Americans could learn. "I hope this survey do a lot of good for Chinese people, make American people realize that Chinese people are humans." I spend a lot of time thinking about that last bit because it comes up a lot, that the Chinese just wanted to be imagined or understood as human. And so I come back to it at the end of the book, and I thought I'd just read a little bit of that too. I end the book with another one of these oral histories taken in 1924 from a very different person, right? Not an old timer, but a young American-born Chinese woman who was a university student at the time. But she too ends her oral history in a very similar way. She says, and she went by an acronym only, MLL. She said, at the end, she said, "I have met several college students who say that I am the first Chinese girl they have ever known personally. They sometimes seem quite surprised to find me as human as they." And so I ended up sort of ending the book trying to think about that. Think about that quote exactly, right? A century after MLL recorded her history, I continue to worry over her words. They sometimes seem quite surprised to find me as human as they. What happens if we still cannot see her humanity, let alone the humanity of all the John Does? MLL may have purposely withheld her name to avoid backlash, but others had no choice in the matter. Their names were lost to history regardless of their wishes. As Western towns and cities attempted to control Chinese migrants in the 19th century, they also stripped them of their individuality. No one cared enough to record Chinese names with any accuracy, let alone document their lives. As a result, Chinese have become ghostly figures, mere shadows of their living selves, appearing in one record only to disappear in another. The gravity of this loss struck me one day as I was paging through the account book of a grave digger in Nevada City, California. William Groves had dutifully recorded the name of each person he buried, the date, and the price of his services. Therefore, we know that Susan Jacobs, Richard Bell, and Frederick Cooler all met their ends in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains. But looking at the years 1861 to 1868, all I could see were the anonymous Chinese. Burial of John Chinaman, paid $35. Burial of John Chinaman, paid $25. Burial of A. Chinaman, $25. Burial of John Chinaman, paid $35. Burial of John Chinaman, paid $20. Burial of a Chinaman, $25. Mr. John Chinaman, coffin for a Chinaman, burial of John 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 Chinaman, burial of Mary Chinaman, burial of Mary Chinaman. Who were these men and women who William Groves laid into the ground? What can we know of their lives? It bothers me that we can see their erasure more clearly than their existence. And it frustrates me that we can see the legal restraints that confined Chinese more clearly than the moments they broke free. When the Nevada City gravedigger buried John and Mary Chinaman, it is possible that the deceased had not yet found their final resting place. Chinese believed that the dead must be returned to their native place where proper rituals could transform them into a spiritual ancestor. Without these rites, the dead would become wandering ghosts, unfed, unclothed, and unable to bring good fortune to their descendants. To avoid this fate, Chinese migrants in the American West prepared for the possibility of death far from home. They bought shares of mutual aid organizations that promised to exhume their bones and repatriate them for burial. Even after Western cities passed laws to restrict this practice, or at least tax it, Chinese continued to reclaim their dead. It is possible, therefore, that someone returned for John and Mary Chinaman years or decades later. Perhaps someone knew their real names, knew where they had come from, and knew where they lay buried. Perhaps someone reclaimed their bones. But just in case no one ever remembered them, perhaps we can.
So thank you for that wonderful talk, Beth. So I really enjoyed your book, first of all, and I'm so excited to get a chance to ask you a few questions about it. One of the things that I think the book does so well is give us a structure for understanding the ways in which American racial law kind of defined and shaped the lives of Chinese Americans, and the ways that Chinese Americans kind of pushed back and resisted against some of those pieces of those legal systems. One of the things you do in your book is that you use a set of archetypes to structure the way in which we think about the ways in which law was shaping Chinese American lives. And each of your chapters actually uses a different archetype, right? So you talk about the coolie, the criminal, the alien, the China woman, the invader, the predator, and the immigrant. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about using these archetypes as a kind of like analytical device to frame the book and what they meant for you, and that a little bit further, please.
Yeah. First, let me just back up and thank you, Professor Wilgau, for being in conversation with me. I really appreciate it, and thank you to the Historical Society for having us. This is amazing, and thanks to my family way back there. This is wonderful. Okay. Yeah, organizing a book is a very challenging thing, is the honest answer. I think you know this as a recent author yourself. So I organized the book into chapters looking at different archetypes or stereotypes that the Chinese faced at the time. I start out with the coolie, so the image of this inherently servile worker who would undercut the white worker, the pre-white man. And then I talk about the Chinese as criminal, the ways in which they start to be understood as inherently criminal, that the entire community was criminal. It wasn't just that they engaged in an occasional criminal act, right? And I talk about the China woman, which is an earlier, a stereotype that predates, you may have heard of sort of the Chinese slave girl. But it's an earlier stereotype, but again, that highly sexualizes Chinese women and imagines them as prostitutes. And I go through these different stereotypes in part to capture why people are passing laws and then policing the Chinese. What are they so afraid of, right? As things come, I think, they may transform into hatred, but they start with fear. What are those fears? And so some of the fears are economic. They're around the coolie, economic, but also racialized, right? And some of them are gendered and sexual, and I talk about that in the case of Chinese women as prostitutes, but then also Chinese men who are seen as potential sexual predators in the community. In part because they were so feminized and put in feminine roles, so as domestic servants or as laundrymen, that these actually then became another fear, that by being treated like women we weren't recognizing. White Americans weren't recognizing the potential danger of these men. And so that's how I did it, was to try to capture those fears and then talk about, okay, what are the laws and policing that comes out of those fears, and then how is it that the Chinese respond?
And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to kind of go in depth into two of these kind of stereotypes or archetypes. But before we do that, one of the things that I find like simultaneously so interesting is you're painting this picture of these stereotypes. You're kind of showing us the way in which larger white society kind of envisions Chinese as being, in many cases, outsiders or outside the boundaries of society. But at the same time, you show the ways in which oftentimes these stereotypes led to a form of inclusion, right? Which you talk about as conditional inclusion. So you have simultaneously the workings of exclusion and inclusion at the same time. Could you tell our audience a little bit more about, when you use the term conditional inclusion, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I think that Chinese American history, we've made great strides, and I have learned so much from my mentor and the scholars before us. I do think that in recent times, a lot of history has focused, not all, but a lot of history has focused on exclusion, on Chinese exclusion, this idea of border control, the idea of keep the Chinese out or expel the ones already here. what I was trying to do in this book is say, okay, yes, that's a huge and structuring force in Chinese people's lives in the United States. Chinese exclusion is. But exclusion doesn't actually accurately describe what's going on interior, what it is that people are experiencing in their everyday lives. And in order to try to talk about the way that I see that, I use this phrase, which is, kind of jargony, but I say conditional inclusion. Not the worst jargon you've ever heard of. By conditional inclusion, I mean that the Chinese were in American society, right? They're living right here. They were employed. They, at times, attended schools. They went to hospitals. They built lives here. They worked here. They built families here. There were ways in which they achieved inclusion. But it's inclusion in a society in the late 19th century, early 20th century that was very hierarchical, right? Racially hierarchical based on lots of other things too, class, gender. And so there were conditions upon them being included. And these conditions ran the gamut, and the laws that I study are one of the things that create these conditions, right? So they, for example, yes, they could work in the United States, but some things they couldn't do. There's certain kinds of work they could not. For example, there were laws against, in certain areas, like we were in Sacramento. In Sacramento, there was a law against Chinese laundries in Sacramento. Here, there was a law against Chinese prostitution in San Francisco. There were also laws targeting Chinese miners, those who were working to try to get gold. And there were laws against aliens or non-citizens fishing or hunting. And so these laws, and then all of the sort of policing that happened around them, either literally by the police or by the community, sort of policing these racial rules, set conditions on Chinese people's lives. So that they were included enough that, one of the reasons that they were included was that they were generating profit for people, right? That people were making a whole lot of money off of the Chinese railroad workers, for example. And the state was making a large amount of revenue off of special taxes that the Chinese had to pay. And so these forms of inclusion were benefiting non-Chinese people as well. There just were these conditions.
So I want to build on this and go a little bit deeper into one of the chapters, right? So your opening chapter, the first chapter after the introduction, is called The Coolie and the Threat of Chinese Labor. And I'm hoping that we can use this kind of chapter as a way to kind of talk a little bit more in depth about, first, how the coolie stereotype worked, and then second, about how this form of conditional inclusion played out in relationship to Chinese labor in California, particularly through the miners' tax, which we talked about extensively in that chapter. So maybe we could start by breaking down, you just did it a little bit more, but talk to us in a little bit more in depth. What was the coolie stereotype? Where did it come from? What did it mean for Chinese laborers?
Yeah. The coolie stereotype, I think it has many origins, but the way I usually describe it to my students is that it was an idea that there was something about the Chinese racially that is inherent, that they would forever be a form of servile labor, a form of cheap labor, that they were slavish, not slaves, never enslaved, but slavish. And I think that as the Chinese were, the timing is key here. The Chinese started coming to California, after the gold rush, but really their numbers jumped in the 1850s into the 1860s. This is a moment when the United States was in the middle of a national, at first rhetorical war over slavery, but then a literal war over slavery. And I think that at this moment, the idea of a racially inferior, inherently servile race was incredibly threatening for people on the West Coast, especially after the Civil War, when they said, we just fought a war over slavery, let's not introduce a new form of slavish servile labor. The truth is, though, that the Chinese were not coolies. They were not indentured. They were not always cheap labor. They were not always unskilled. They had lots of skills. They developed more here in California. And a lot of them were independent. So the gold miners that came over, in my first chapter I talk about foreign miners. The gold miners came over, they weren't like the other prospectors, the other 49ers looking to strike it rich. They worked in small groups, they formed sort of small companies amongst themselves to share profit and share loss. They were independent. And therefore, because they didn't fit this, they were a threat.
So how does this stereotype of the coolie, we're in this period right after the discovery of gold in California, and Chinese miners are coming, like so many other miners, to the state of California to look for gold. And then you have this passage of this California Miners Act. Could you talk a little bit more about the Miners Act, what it was, and how it related to the stereotype of the coolie?
Yeah, so California, first of all, California was a brand new state. It had very little money. It was mostly in the red. There was an original foreign miners tax that was passed in 1850 that didn't last more than a couple of months because it was written broadly and it affected all people, including Europeans, people coming from Latin America, and it was an exorbitant amount that they asked them to pay. They revamped it in 1852 to specifically target the Chinese. And what I talk about is that the lawmakers considered various options at the time. And I think this gives us a sense of this inclusion, right? So they considered a bill that would have excluded the Chinese from the mines entirely. Just, no Chinese made mine in the state of California. They also considered a bill that would have indentured the Chinese legally. Would have said, okay, the Chinese can come over, but they will be indentured to white people and they will mine for them. And then they considered what they did, the tax. The tax is $4 a month for any foreign miner who is not able to naturalize. This is code language for the Chinese, since the Chinese were racially barred from naturalization, as were other Asian groups. And by taxing $4 a month, that's not so much that you can't survive. But it is enough that it's a huge amount of money. That the state of California made $5 million by enforcing the foreign miners tax over the period of basically like 16 years, something like that. 5 million, that's a huge amount of money. In 1 year, it was 20% of state revenue was foreign miner tax. And 99% of this tax was being paid by Chinese. And so, but it gives you a sense they're being included in part in order to be exploited.
Right, yeah. So how did this, well, actually one other question before I get to that. One of the things I found interesting about this was that in your book you talk about the ways in which this foreign miners tax actually ended up being endorsed by some of the district associations here in San Francisco. So could you talk a little bit about why they would endorse it or back it as opposed to fight it?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that the sort of precursors to the Chinese six companies endorsed this tax in the 1850s. They said this. They met with the mining committee from Sacramento, from the legislature, and said, okay, we're okay with this idea of a tax. Would you just let us send a translator along with your tax collector? And the reason that they wanted that was because people were dying. Because tax collection is not what we think of tax collection today, right? You don't just like file your taxes. No, instead, it was a tax collector just, often on horseback, just riding around the gold country and stopping when they saw Chinese people and demanding money. That's what tax collecting. And you can see how that would quickly become violent. Because if they didn't have the money, then the tax collector was allowed to take any of their possessions and sell them instantly. So you can imagine this was a lethal business, tax collecting. And so the Chinese district associations simply said, like, can we simply send along a translator so that these people can tell that they're not being robbed and instead are being taxed, like these basic things. But they endorsed it, I think, because the idea was, well, a tax means that the Chinese are allowed to mine, right? Yeah. It acknowledges, the state had acknowledged that they were allowed to be here and to mine. And they thought that maybe that was like a window into it. And I talk about how in some of the gold country communities Chinese would actually, as they moved into a new town, they would walk into town and pay their tax in advance to the community. Sort of they're like, we're here, we want to be here, but you're going to benefit from this too. Let us give you some money, or maybe you can call it a bribe. Bribe your way into it. Depends how you look at it. But it gives a sense that there was something protective about this law. And one of the things that I write about is that it truly became protective at one point. When a group of miners threatened to drive the Chinese out of the mines, the state government actually sent in troops and sent in pistols to try to quell anti-Chinese violence against Chinese miners, because the argument was they had been paying their taxes. And I think, I'll just say one more thing, I think taxpayer is an interesting way to claim rights. You know, so the Chinese weren't able to become citizens, which is maybe the classic way that someone claims rights. You know, I'm a citizen, I deserve some rights. Instead, they're saying, I'm a taxpayer, I deserve some rights. And this is striking to me because it's a strategy that African Americans have been using for a long time. You know, even back into the antebellum period, free blacks would argue for things like, you should educate my children because I am paying taxes. So it's interesting to see this similar strategy on the part of the Chinese.
And as you're talking in the chapter, you can see the ways in which this example shows these kind of like simultaneously excluding and including, right? I mean, on the one hand, you've got this miners' tax, which is a racist law because it's being only targeted towards Chinese folks, or primarily towards Chinese folks. And then at the same time, the fact that they're literally paying the tax is a form of inclusion, right? And so it's working in the same way. I wanted like to kind of wrap it up here, and then we're going to open it up a little bit more to questions from the audience. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought this tax to the end, this miners' tax to an end? Why did it stop?
It stopped. Well, the Chinese fought this tax in so many different ways over the years, because it existed for, I think it's 18 years in California. They fought it in so many ways. They fought it, you know, in real time when a tax collector attempted to take their money, and I used the court cases to talk about the moments when Chinese resisted physically against the tax collector, which usually did not end well for them. But we know that they did. They did things like just try to avoid the tax collector, right? This is what we would do, just hide out, avoid the tax collector. There's clearly, they attempted to lobby. There's reports of a Chinese person visiting the legislature, and so it appears that they tried to lobby. The Chinese consulate lobbied on their behalf to try to fight this. But also they filed lawsuits, and ultimately that's what ended it. After Congress passed the Enforcement Act, or the Civil Rights Act of 1870, which was designed to fight the Ku Klux Klan in the South, right? To fight the discrimination that was happening against newly freed black people, that Enforcement Act. The Chinese sued using that act and saying this and the 14th Amendment shows that states cannot discriminate in this way. And I think and they won. They sued a particular tax collector, they won, and this scared all the tax collectors from continuing to collect it. The legislature didn't actually repeal the law, but no one was collecting anything because they knew they would be sued. And I think, again, this gives us a sense of the ways in which this history is really connected to other things happening in the United States at that time. Right? It's coming out of some of the black litigation and civil rights that have been fought for in the South.
So my final question before we open to the audience is, so we have these set of archetypes or stereotypes that you use to kind of organize the book. And yet in the last, recently we've entered into this moment of heightened anti-immigrant rhetoric, right? And some of that is certainly directed towards Asian Americans, but lots of it is directed towards immigrants from Mexico or Latin America. I'm curious to what extent you find the archetypes that you use in your book from the 19th century to be applicable to thinking about the kind of racist policies and laws or perceptions that are floating around now against immigrants in the United States today.
Yeah, it is really disturbing how how close and valent some of the rhetoric of the 19th century against the Chinese feels to this moment of anti-immigrant, the blatant anti-immigrant rhetoric we're in today, and more than rhetoric, of course. Sometimes when I talk to my students about it, I'm like, they're saying the same thing, only they said it in better English back in the 1970s. More grammatical. But yes, I think a lot of these images, even the coolie, which yes, it's very particular to the Chinese, but just that idea of that they're cheap and expendable, that they are a threat to white labor, American labor, or that they are criminals, or that I think that's sort of the attack on women is slightly different, maybe not so much on the concept of lewdness, but more sort of the threat of that mother, right? Like there's a fear of the American-born child, of the non-citizen mother, right? So it's still a fear of reproduction, immigrant reproduction. So yeah, it's disturbing how we see these echoes through time.
So I'm gonna pause there. I'm gonna open it up. We can ask questions about if you've read the book. We can ask questions. If you have just general questions building on what we said, I'll bring the mic around so people can talk.
Maybe I'll stand up just so I can see.
Okay.
Do you want me to stand up or sit down? First of all, I think I took a quick look at the laundryman exhibit upstairs on the way down here, and I'm an absolute sucker for the Bruce Lee exhibit as well. But I guess my question for you is, that guy who you said was a former SF police officer from the Bancroft Library, because I'm a Berkeley grad and I recognize the library right away, but did he ever, when you were talking to him for the book, did he ever talk to you about like how long he was a police officer for? Because I think before she had me, my mom was a police officer dispatcher here on the radio, but this is like way before she had me.
Yeah. So Jesse Brown Cook is long dead.
Okay.
But his scrapbooks live on,
Okay.
I think. So I'm just using his scrapbooks and trying to recreate, create his life to the best extent possible. So he was a police officer, sort of moved up through the ranks in the 1880s, and then I think he was a chief of police in the 1920s or so, and then retired after that.
Because I think when my mom was with them, I think this was like sometime in the 70s, because this is way before I was born, so I just thought I'd ask you.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor Lew-Williams. Sorry. Just want to ask, I'm really curious about that database you created. Will it ever be posted online, or is it just internal for now? Because there's been talk of people trying to do this for a long time, so yeah, that's my question.
That's the goal, is to get it online. It is a complicated process. Because to get into the weeds a little bit more about how we did this, right? So statute books, some of them are printed. Right? Like, so if you go to California, the California statutes, you can look at them, they're printed. And so for those, what we had to do was OCR them, so like make the machine recognizable and extract them and then search them. But a bunch of them were also handwritten. So we hired research assistants, lovely undergrads, who still can read cursive. Undergrads
can read cursive? Those are Princeton students, that's why, right?
That's my criteria. When they come in, I say, can you read cursive? 19th century cursive. Okay. Who have to then type up the laws. And so, unfortunately, they're not pretty, right? So, especially the ones that the machine has done. So we have, random spaces between things, or like it'll capture, it'll say digitized by Stanford in the midst of a sentence, as we like, because the machine can't quite pull all these things out. So it's not pretty, but we're working on it, trying to make it available. We're really excited about this, the way that we've done this, in part because it hasn't been done for other kinds of laws. right? I get sometimes the opportunity to talk at law schools, and the lawyers are very interested in this, because even in law school, they don't usually look at city ordinances unless they've been challenged, unless they end up in a court case. And so, for example, low-hanging fruit would be to try to do the Jim Crow laws. No one has ever tried to document Jim Crow laws. We know this is so central to U.S. history, but no one has tried to actually catalog them in this way. And I think that, a lot of people talk about all the fears of all the AI things, and yes, there are scary things for us in academia, but we also need to think about the ways we can use it to our advantage, and doing these big data projects is one of the ways to do it.
So a quick follow-up on that. So you said you've got multiple municipalities you're drawing from. Is this how comprehensive is this? I mean, how did you, were these the ones that you actually hit on the road trip? Or how did you go about determining which municipalities or which local ordinances to include in this database?
I mean, it's not perfect. It's 182 municipalities. We picked ones that were this town had to become incorporated by 1880. So some of the places that didn't become incorporated till later, we don't have. And then some places like San Francisco, you guys know what happened in San Francisco. We had the earthquake and fire. And so there's lots of reasons why we don't have laws for a particular place.
But you're actually able to get, for most municipalities, let's say California, Oregon, and Washington, after 1880, that get their actual laws.
So we'll, not every year, but laws tend to stay more than 1 year, unless, an example would be Sacramento, where we have between 1850 and 1920, I think that we have 6 complete records of their statute books. So we get these moments in time. The tricky thing about this, if you think about it, is it does make it difficult to make broad arguments about things like change over time, or which place was worse than the other, because the records are still inconsistent. But we can look within a particular city and look at change over time. We're trying to think about, we're actually going to work towards a publication more in the social sciences about this. Yeah.
Nice. Other questions out there?
First of all, I wanted to thank you for doing such important work. It really means a lot, I'm sure, to everyone in here. But my question was about that photo with the 2,700 boy baby, that collage. I find it curious that he only did the boy babies. And so I'm kind of wondering if there weren't that many girl babies. Was there female infanticide even here in America versus in China, where we know it's rampant? So
why boy babies? Okay, so when I look at this photo very closely, which I have, I don't think they are all boy babies. Also, I don't think there are 2,700 of them. There weren't that many babies in 1889 in San Francisco, period, right? So I think of it more as the label reflects his fears rather than the reality. And so what he was scared of were boys. And I think that one of the reasons he's focused on the boys, he's thinking about citizenship, right? They're born in America and therefore U.S. citizens. That's more fearful because they could vote, right? They're less worried about that with the girls. And then I think it's also this, because the population of Chinese at the time were disproportionately male, by an extreme margin, 1880, 18 men for every 1 woman in the Chinese community. It may just be that he thinks of the Chinese community as male. I mean, this is not logical, of course, but thinks of it as male and the menace as male.
I'm fascinated by the database too. I'd be interested in learning more and reading more about it. I want to know more about your research methodology. Did you ever consider or use the various state laws that deal with open records acts? Because I spent more than 50 years of my life in law and 30 years as a city attorney. And one thing you can do, if you haven't done already, there's a shotgun and open records act request to every jurisdiction you can think of, ask them for a very pointed thing, or an ordinance dealing with Chinese for whatever period of time, and by law, they're supposed to have it respond within 10 days, or tell you why they can't respond within 10 days, and when they'll get back to you. So that's just, I'm just curious
That's very
how you
interesting.
approach that.
Have you ever used open records?
I've never done that.
So I haven't, and one of the reasons I haven't is because these things are mostly freely available to me because they're more than 100 years old. It is very difficult to get state records or city records often if they're less than 100 years old, but the rules sort of change at 100 years. And so usually I can walk in and see these records. That said, I am trying to piggyback on changes that are happening. So this is a bit of a digression, but you may have noticed in California, I think it was now maybe 3 years ago, the legislature passed a bill saying that every municipality, every county must go through all of their deeds, your house deeds, and like excise racial language, because it became a very common practice. Started with the Chinese in the 19th century, but became a very common practice in California for people to write racial restrictions into their deeds in the early 20th century. So only white people can live here, only Caucasian people can live here. I remember when I was a student at Stanford, we would look at the deeds right there in Palo Alto. There's lots of them, really close by, folks. And some of these things, over time, someone had modified their deeds, but since California didn't make it easy, it's still, like, when you buy a house, you should still look, if it's an old enough house, to make sure that it's not in your deed. So this new law is forcing every county to go through the old deeds and pull out this racist language. And so I've been writing to the county saying, while you're doing this, can you send me these deeds? Because I think when the government is spending so much time going back through old records, we as researchers should try to make as much use of this as possible.
Can I just ask a question on feedback of that? If they're excising the records, does that effectively erase that history though, permanently from the records?
I mean, this is a complicated thing, right? I think what they want to do is they want to take it out of the current day deeds, so that when someone is buying or selling a house, they don't have to read this incredibly racist language in the process, which I am completely sympathetic to. But I think that, yes, in the process, they also need to digitize these records and preserve them in some way, so we don't lose the history in the process of trying to update the way that we buy and sell houses.
With the mic.
Thank you so much for your talk. I mean, I thought it was wonderfully presented. I had a question about your research, particularly with the southern states. Did you find that there were specific laws against the Chinese in those states? Or were they just brought in under laws that were meant more for African Americans?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So my study is really on the West Coast, and the circumstances on the West Coast are really different. One of the things, so the short answer to your question is that in general, the laws that regulate the Chinese on the West Coast were intended to regulate the Chinese. And the laws in the South, that some of them regulated Chinese, but they happened to regulate Chinese, and they really were focused on regulating Black people. And the difference there, I don't talk about the South, and that isn't the focus of my research, but I think the difference, on simplest terms, can be understood most simply by demographics, right? The Chinese were the largest non-white population in California by 1870. And that's because of the decimation of the population of Native people. Right? Before that, there were more Native people. But there's 20 times as many Chinese as there are Black people in the 1880s and 1890s. It makes some degree of racist sense that the lawmakers are focused on the Chinese in particular. these laws that we see on the West Coast focused on the Chinese are not replicated in the South in general. There's some, now as I'm saying it, I can think of counterexamples. A counterexample would be anti-miscegenation laws. So the laws against interracial marriage, where there had long time been anti-miscegenation laws came about in the South after the Civil War, barring white and black. But on the West Coast, they also barred Orientals or Chinese or sometimes Mongolians from marrying white people, and then slowly that statute was adopted in some southern states. They started adding the terminology of Mongolian or Chinese or Oriental, even though there were very few people. I think there's a lot more to be done about this borrowing that happens. I talk in my book about racial zoning laws, so laws that say like a race may not live in this area, something that's very clearly unconstitutional and doesn't survive for very long. But it starts here on the West Coast to keep the Chinese out. You know, one of the laws is the Bingham Ordinance here in San Francisco that said that the Chinese may no longer live in Chinatown and instead had to move to an area that was mostly occupied by slaughterhouses. That law the Chinese challenged immediately and won, and so that's why we have Chinatown today. But that law was in effect copied by racial zoning ordinances that were attempted against black people in the early 20th century, so like about a decade and a half later. And so we see sort of borrowing, a disturbing kind of experimentation and borrowing that means that these two histories are related to each other, even though they're not the same.
Thank you for coming to San Francisco to speak. We very much appreciate it. I wanted to broaden Lori's question a little bit and touch on how earlier you said that the laws that originated in California and in Oregon and in Washington became expanded to 5,000 laws across the country. So I'm wondering if you take all the states, including Hawaii, and the experience of Chinese American communities in those states, are there any communities in those other states that you would use as anecdotes to say, here was an experience that was similar to what the Chinese faced in California or Tacoma or Seattle or Portland, etc., whether it's a better experience as a community that they lived in or a worse experience as a community as compared to the California Chinese American experience?
Yeah, California is a unique. California is a unique story because there were so many Chinese here. When I'm talking with my students, one of the things I talk about is how different it was to be in New York Chinatown versus San Francisco Chinatown at like the turn of the 20th century. For example, so in New York there was no anti-miscegenation law, and so there's patterns of Chinese marrying mostly Irish women in New York City. But that was illegal here in California. It's also true that even, so I said very briefly, I'm going to talk about naturalization, so let me back up and just tell you a little bit about naturalization. So the Chinese were racially barred from naturalization. It was started with a 1790 act that said that only white people could become U.S. citizens, white immigrants could become U.S. citizens. That changed a bit in 1870 when the Congress said that only white or black people can become U.S. citizens. But it continued this bar on Chinese naturalization until the 1940s. So that's the traditional narrative we tell about naturalization that I just told you here. And it's true here in California. But in my research, what I found is that Chinese did naturalize. In fact, they naturalized in dozens of states across the United States. And they did so, I think, in part because they weren't in large numbers. Individual courthouses that they walked into may or may not have understood the law and may or may not have cared, right? And so people managed to naturalize in New York, but also in places like Kansas and Tennessee. And there's a little bit of permissibility that was possible, I think, in these places where they weren't such a large population. And we can see this really dramatically when Chinese people moved And so there's Chinese who were able to naturalize in other states, sometimes move to California, and then they would get forcibly denaturalized here if they tried to show up and vote at a poll or something like that.
So that's going to have to be it for our questions. I'd like to thank Dr. Beth Lew-Williams for speaking. She will be available afterwards if you want to come up and ask individual questions and also to sign books. Thanks for coming out to our talk today, and hope to see you all at future events. Oh yes, there's food here too, folks. So please don't sneak out without getting some food.